so it seems. But knight takes c5. Potentially there's a dangerous thought of king queen. If b4 is played and this bishop ever leaves the diagonal, it will be a disaster because of knight e4. So the bishop goes back to b1. And here, maybe Carlsen did go wrong. He played a move which I thought he might play, because the reason I thought he might play this is to just simply avoid the knight takes d5 stuff. Because really, black wants to get in the ideal world b4 to chase the knight back, then bishop f5, then e4 will be grossly weak if black can just simply exchange off the light squared bishop. But if he does b4 straight away, it falls tactically to knight takes d5. This is an unpleasant, shocking move. So c takes d, queen takes d5 check. We have a fork here, and also bishop e6 protecting the rook is not good because the knight's dropping. Queen takes c5 might be fine here, no problems. So actually knight takes d5 is a real threat against this positional plan of b4 and bishop f5. Seems logical, nice, natural, but to knight d5, that has to change the plan slightly. Now Carlsen played king h8, so perhaps with the idea of b4 and bishop f5. The problem is, white stopped b4 altogether by playing it himself, so he played b4, and white seems to be coming back into the game a little bit. If we go back here, there was a suggestion for bishop b7, I think, from Poganina. So bishop b7, and I think that was later confirmed also by Deep Ribka as also preference for bishop b7. Personally, I like the bishop on f5 in the ideal world to get more control over the e4 square, with this bishop can be exchanged off. This bishop seems a bit silly to be behind the chain, but maybe there's a lot of logic to it. If knight e6, maybe c5 later, d4, and this bishop will be liberated on the diagonal. But is white's definitely worse here? Knight e2. b4 is possible actually here, because if queen takes, there's knight d3 check. Bishop takes, queen takes b4. And then, okay, the bishop can also be threatening to come to a6. So knight fd4, say. It's pleasant for black. But I'm not convinced myself that the bishop's great there necessarily on b7. So Carlsen played what I felt was a natural move, king h8. The problem is this rook is on h1. So h4, h5 from white is going to be dangerous with the king as a sitting target for the rook, which doesn't now need to develop to the centre. If the white king's holding up e3, the white rook, this one is not necessarily needed to move, or maybe this one can move instead. So we saw b4 from white to stop all this b4 stuff. Knight b7. Now the knight, although looking awkward there, it's ready to spring back into the position. Knight d6 and knight c4s are going to be dangerous for white. So that was Carlsen's intention. White, though, is trying to get a grip on these two squares, although black is trying to get grips on these squares. So we have a fierce positional battle for square control in the centre. Knight e2, knight d6, knight ed4. White also has nice pressure on the c line, but this is squashed now with the knight c4 move. So it seems again to be unpleasant for white. Queen d3 was played. So I wonder, in this position, can black have just played, say, bishop f5? Is that so bad, actually? Or maybe knight takes, is even g takes. I don't know if this is possible. Knight d4 seems okay for black. Black seems to be better even in this position. He never actually did play bishop f5 at some moments coming up. So what he did do was bishop d7, which seems also another good move. Now white went in, to get some counterplay on the h files at h4. So does white have time for this? Carlsen played rook a e8, which allows h5. So maybe that was a bit risky. Ribka's idea is bishop f6, just for interest. Now saying h5. There's g5, so that's the idea, to be able to support g5. Quite tactical. The queen's also just about protecting h7 from being mated. So maybe that's interesting as well. So the way Carlsen played it, it seemed that white got a little bit back in the game now, very soon. So rook c1, and he snatched this pawn, actually, this b pawn, which, to be honest, I didn't even notice was on actually earlier. It was when this knight c4 was on, and the queen moved. So b4 was a gambit, and it wasn't taken here. It wasn't taken here actually, maybe because of knight takes c6. So knight c6, and maybe white's not so bad. So it was delayed, but it was still on here. Now after h4 it was definitely a gambit, because queen b4, h5, you don't want this ferocious attack necessarily. But actually rook a8 was played first, then taking the gambit. So he went in for the ferocious attack after all, allowing h5. So he's got to time things quite correctly now, otherwise the unfortunately crude setup from white is going to start working against this black king if black is not too careful and get carried away with positional play at the expense of his king safety. So he plays knight d6 after hg. Now here it's interesting, or even in this position, instead of knight d6 to knight e4, that does seem tempting, but bishop f5 has to be considered. Because if knight takes, g takes, at least there's no hg's from white, and so the h pawn is still, blocking the rook. I think black would be positionally, it looks amazing positionally, actually, if you think about it. I mean, where is white's attack? If white has to play h6 here, okay, so let's get the bishop out of the way without allowing queen takes f5. So the bishop maybe goes to c3, rook e2, rook e7. Maybe it's not so clear how black increases the advantage, to be fair. On the other hand, I don't know. g3, now knight d6 to e4 again might be stronger than the game. So maybe Carlsen did miss a chance to really pressurise the opponent positionally if he had played bishop f5. So he played knight d6 at hg, seemed to give white some resources down the h file. But nevertheless, after knight e4 check, there was a big storm coming up now. h6, now rook c1, white's still in trouble, and Carlsen plays queen b2, so immediately threatening things like queen f2. So queen c2 to stop that. Queen goes to a3, attacking now e3 from the side. Rook e1 seems to be a logical defensive move, but it wasn't actually played. In fact, the move knight b3 was played, and I really thought Wang Yue had it, to be honest, because I thought c5 here. I thought there's no way he can survive against c5. So if knight takes c5, then there's queen takes e3 check, and it just looks disaster for white. But white held on here. Was there any other good moves? I mean, c5 seems to be the most aggressive in terms of using the pawn structure to try and increase the pressure. But maybe other quieter moves need to be considered, or even just a5. Okay, so after knight b3, c5 was played, so rook e1. Now bishop f5, and Carlsen, seems to have a very comfortable, nice position. But white plays another awkward-looking knight on the rim move, knight h4. So it seems to be a bit of a ridiculous game from white that he's played earlier knight a4, and now he's playing knight h4. So we go back to that old expression, it all depends on the position. So he's playing moves which maybe you could argue they're tailored to the position. If black hasn't got a clear attack here, then knight h4 is justified. So black played c4, and now knight takes f5, and here I was getting kind of excited by white's tactical possibilities.